No, I'm not in my office today. No. I'm not supposed to be in my office unless I'm doing admin work. So today I'm at home. Okay, so hey everybody, welcome back to our interview series. I'm Dr. Shaan from Vitality Chiropractic, and we're going to be going through with other healthcare professionals, talking about their stories, talking about the people they serve, and of course, how they got started. Today's guest is David. David is a practicing psychologist here in Singapore. He's originally from America and spent over a decade practicing in California. David used traditional therapy coupled with meditation, coping techniques, and wellness advice to help his patients and has experience helping children to young adults to the elderly with cases from depression, anxiety, to even suicide. David, how are things going?
Uh, Very well. Actually, I try not to counsel completed suicides. That's not considered a success. But yeah, if people are feeling suicidal, I do know.
Oh, of course, yeah, absolutely. So before we get started today, for someone who's maybe never seen a psychologist before or doesn't know much about psychology, how would you describe psychology to them?
Well, psychology actually stems from the Greek word that means soul, um, and so that's a pretty lofty concept. The way that I look at it that relates to soul is actually helping people become fully themselves, to self-actualize, and in that way to materialize what we might consider soul. So people can approach that in many different ways, but the way that I approach it is generally looking at what a person wants, their ideal life, comparing that with how things are, and then finding a way to bring their real and ideal lives more in sync, to make those what we call congruent. So I would say that in the abstract, it's empowering people's souls from coming through, but in practicality, it's really about helping people make their actual line up with their ideal.
And if we go back to the beginning, then, how did you decide that you wanted to become a psychologist?
Well, there's kind of different levels to that, as you would expect from a psychologist. So going to the deepest level, I would tell you that if not for my parents' divorce, I wouldn't have become a psychologist. Um, it was a very difficult and trying, not only the divorce, but the years following for me. And and so I basically worked very hard to not let those kinds of things hold me back from uh, being able to trust and have a meaningful relationship, and to figure out how to deal with a blended family. So figuring out how to negotiate differences and communicate. And so I basically decided that because I experienced those trials and tribulations early in my life, I wanted to take not only the struggles, but the strengths that I grew out of them, and make them of use to others, other kids and families going through similar or related things.
It's kind of interesting. I think I see this quite a lot even in my own profession. The number of people who became a chiropractor because they saw a chiropractor, and it's kind of, I think it's something ubiquitous all the way through healthcare as well.
Yeah, yeah.
So
There's a concept called the wounded healer, and so I think the best use of a challenge is to turn it into a gift, and so that's what being a psychologist has done for me. Now, to give sort of another level of explanation, I initially was studying theater arts in college,
okay,
and I took psychology classes to support my involvement in what's called method acting. And in method acting, a person really does a lot of internal processes to bring out external expressions of character and conflict and so forth. And so when I started taking psychology classes, I actually realized that I was probably better at that than I was in acting. And so I ended up kind of incorporating acting and theatrical stuff in my profession. I practice psychodrama, and I use a lot of the same kinds of skills to use myself as an instrument in sessions generally. I even had a radio show. I've done some stand-up comedy. So those things have still kind of continued to become part of my life, but for my day job, I switched over and became a psychologist.
Okay, and tell me a bit more about the story of kind of, you mentioned, of course, starting more in theatrics and then, of course, going into psychology. How did you then go into, say, furthering your studies and practice, and then, of course, ending up here in Singapore?
Well, it's a very long road, or at least I took a very long road. So in America, to get into a clinical psychology doctoral program is more competitive than medical school. And so you actually have to really distinguish yourself from very, very early on. And so um, I basically, you mount this whole campaign. You work as a research assistant, and you work as a teaching assistant, and I went and did behavioral therapy with an autistic boy, and you basically just try to like put in all this work, and then the first year that I applied, I say first year because there was a second year, uh, I ended up getting only rejections. I went out every day to my mailbox checking, and I thought they're gonna want me, but no. Only one letter came, and it was from a master's program at Columbia University. And they said, hey, if you come and do this master's in developmental psychology, then 90% of our graduates get into doctoral programs. So I did that. I took a back door, and then next year that I applied, I got into like all but two of the places I applied to. So then I went on, and I entered the longest doctoral program in psychology in the United States, University of Texas at Austin. And so then I put in another 8 years to get the doctorate. And then I went and did a year of internship at a VA medical center, all of which just gets you to the point of then needing to do 3,000 hours of additional supervised experience. And so I worked in community mental health and got my supervised hours. Then there comes a written test and an oral test, and finally they give you the paper, and you're off and running. And so from that point, there was a whole bunch of different kinds of jobs that I had, including working in other people's group practices. I became the clinical director of a freestanding psychiatric and chemical dependency center. I worked for the court systems as an evaluator, just kind of did a whole bunch of different things until I eventually formed my own practice. And I ran that practice in California for 14 years, saw tons and tons and tons of people. And really it was just through all of those hours of exposure that I finally have now found my own style that is getting really good results and getting really good feedback from the public. But I'll tell you a curious thing. Malcolm Gladwell, the author and journalist who wrote Blink, he studied how many hours of exposure it takes to become proficient at different professions. The thing that he found were the two professions that take the most exposure to become masterful are architect and psychologist. And so I would tell you, here in Singapore, there's no regulations regarding, becoming a psychologist. People can do it with just a bachelor's degree or even a diploma. But really, if you're wanting good quality care, look for the person who's had a lot of experience, because it's not something that you can just get from a 40-hour seminar.
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, it's the same thing for chiropractors here. Technically, there is no legislature in place. Of course, there's someone like myself, because I'm a foreigner, I have to have a qualification to work here. But we kind of have the same issues as well. I know even I personally went to speak with a counselor here before. I wish I'd gone to speak to someone else at the time, if I'm honest. But yeah, so how did you end up then in Singapore?
Well, it's a very curious thing. I've been studying Buddhism for the past 12 years, and there are different what are called precepts in Buddhism, kind of like rules. And so when you first become a Buddhist, maybe you follow 5 precepts that tell you, don't hurt animals, don't kill, use good speech and so forth. But as you go along, maybe you'll try adopting more and more. And when you get to number 10, it says take no money. And so I really struggled with that. And I talked to the monk and I said, I'm confused here because it seems like that would be difficult to take no money. And the monk said, not difficult. And I said, no, you don't get it. See, I have bills. So if I'm not taking money, I'm not giving money. So it'd be difficult. He said, not difficult. And so that then led me to a sort of line of contemplation. And I eventually came to the place where I realized that maybe if I let go of all of my overhead and expenses and move to a place that's much more affordable, I would not be under such pressure to receive money, that I could actually help people without needing to get paid large sums. And so I ended up selling my big house, my BMW, and etc. And I moved to Thailand, and I actually spent time there, continuing to study meditation and with monks, about learning about philosophy and Buddhist ideas. But I also cared for villagers without any expectation of payment. And I even contemplated becoming a monk. But I ended up having a very kind of a awakening conversation with a monk, in which basically he said to me something like, dude, you're taking this all way too seriously. Just be a person. And all of a sudden, I had like this realization that, wait a second, I don't have to put on a robe. I can actually embody all of these things that I really value by being, a psychologist, by being a cool person, by, in fact, even you and I met because I saw you posting about looking for opportunities to volunteer and care for people without any expectation of anything in return. And I said, yeah, that's exactly what I want to do. And then you and I ended up, kind of connecting and realizing that we shared a commonality. And so that then kind of liberated me from really being so kind of uptight and hardcore about thinking about this precept as sort of like I must not take money, and just realizing that no, I basically can I can have a career, and I can accept payment for my services, but I could also care for people without expectation of payment. And essentially in Buddhism we talk about this thing called the middle path, and that led me into realizing that no, I could come back into Eastern Western society and just be myself, be a person. And so I moved to Singapore and I accepted a job as a psychologist, and here I am.
Okay, it's interesting you say that. Actually, I was reading a book earlier by Pema Chodron. She's talking about, again, ideas within Buddhism. One she's talking about is bodhicitta, and a lot of it is kind of like I guess you were told by one of the monks of not taking things too seriously. That we look at the life of what they call the warrior, and we think, oh, we have to do everything like them. It's like, but that's a warrior. Not everyone has to do every single part of every aspect to kind of get there.
Exactly. Yeah. And that idea of bodhicitta, awakened heart, is really, the most important thing about that I've gotten from Buddhism. And actually, that's the most precious thing that I found in Thailand. The Thai people are very beautiful. There's so much beautiful nature. But the thing that I really found there that made the biggest impression on me was loving kindness, the value of practicing loving kindness. And so I actually have something that I want to do. I'm inspired to do a project of actually bringing Westerners to Thailand and doing retreat and taking them to meet with the monks that I know and go visit monasteries, but then also to not only practice heart opening and really sort of cultivate that attitude, but then actually allow it to materialize in doing service with people and with animals, and then to hopefully help them build on that bodhicitta. You know, we always say that after we do different kinds of spiritual practices, you know, we'll say like, you know, may there be an awakening in the person whose heart hasn't yet opened, and then may the person whose heart already is open may grow. And that's really the heart of Buddhism to me. And that's something that if I really boil down like what I see as my deepest calling is to certainly practice that, but also to share it and to help people realize really the value of giving and opening themselves and caring for others.
There's actually a charity I started working with just before, of course, all of the circuit breaker stuff started. So, of course, it's all been paused. It's something I may talk with you afterwards. I think they would be interested in, of course, having someone that they could have some of their people talk to. How have you found the giving kind of community or ethos within Singapore compared to when you're in Thailand?
Well, yeah. First of all, I think that people on an individual level, I think really are looking for opportunities to give and care. I think that systemically, I think that maybe it's just that the philosophy perhaps of not wanting people to be too dependent or to go against maybe, you know, some of the communism that they initially were escaping. I think that there's some struggle to figure out how to incorporate that into the culture on a broader level. But on a individual person level, I'm finding people to be very open and caring once you start getting to know them. Yeah. And I think that there's a really a respect and a valuing for people who they recognize as coming from a pure giving place.
Absolutely. I think there's almost sometimes a little bit of apprehension of why would someone do something for free.
Yeah, are you up to something? Yeah, I think you told me about some of those experiences when you first maybe did some giving with the People's Association.
Yeah.
And yeah,
Yeah, I think they've been very open to it, but otherwise there's a lot of places where they wonder why, I guess.
yeah, I know, and I guess I would tell people that that was another thing that I really feel grateful for in getting to know you is you're making an introduction to me to the People's Association, and I haven't yet um, been able to do service through them, but I'm really eager to look for opportunities to do that, and they were so open and encouraging, and it was a really nice interaction. I just hasn't yet come to fruition.
Yeah, unfortunately, I think because of, again, all the things that are going on, delays are going to happen, of course. It's completely understandable.
Yeah.
So kind of going back to more about psychology, and for some people, of course, who may be watching who may have never seen a psychologist, they may not have also seen a psychiatrist, and they may not know the difference. Would you mind explaining for people a bit about the difference, and then what personally drew you more to say psychology rather than psychiatry?
Well, you know, I think initially psychiatrists used to practice therapy much like I do, but I think that especially with some of the changes that have happened in healthcare, many have just basically relegated themselves to prescribing of medication, and then they send folks off to see someone like me for the therapy. And so certainly one of the factors that drew me to psychology was that I think my gifts are in terms of um, using myself as an instrument, not using chemicals or pills per se. And I think philosophically, as a result, what I try to do is I try to empower people to be able to promote wellness for themselves and not be dependent on something. Uh, you know, there are situations where a person is probably not likely to be able to regulate it, like for say schizophrenia or something like that, where medications can be useful. But the research really shows that, say for depression or a lot of anxiety disorders, we can get the same results. It just takes a little bit more effort. And so some enlightened psychiatrists realize that. And I actually have a friend whose card on the back, it says, I can give you a pill, but I'd rather teach you a skill. And but that's kind of rare, few and far between that you find that in psychiatry. More that philosophy is more from a psychologist.
Do you find that that's
But
different
when
here in the culture or compared to the States?
I
Or is it?
actually found that more psychiatrists in the States practice therapy. You know, there are more in the States who do a little bit of both. Here, they're primarily just giving up medication. Um, on a more personal level, I get a little bit grossed out by blood and gore and guts. And so the idea of going to medical school and having to like cut open cadavers and stuff like that just was kind of a turn off to me. So I have to admit that was also part of it.
And that's about it. We had cadavers at my university. It was fine with me. I just didn't like the idea of the medication and surgery of actually doing it with people myself. So I completely understand that.
Yeah, actually, then I went back to massage school just recently, and there's some guy who does a lot of cadaver demonstrations about the stickiness that forms between muscles and how they can adhere, and so I had to watch some cadaver movies, but somehow I was able to endure that a little bit better now.
So tell me about some of the biggest challenges you've had, whether it's either, say, professionally or moving or anything else that you think would be good for people to know.
I think that the biggest challenge for me has been balancing the business side with my pure heart helping side. And I have done a number of different things to try to reconcile those parts. I started my own group practice, which I ran for 14 years. And at some points in time, I took on lots of different employees and contractors, and I was gonna, I don't know, become a multi-billionaire, I thought in my mind or something. But then in practice, there were a number of things that got in the way. I ended up taking on a lot of insurances, which pay very little, and then I wanted my clinicians to be able to have a good life, and so I paid them very generously. And so I found myself just working very, very hard, but not materializing a lot of profit. Then I shrunk down, and I just thought, okay, I'm just going to do my own practice, and I'm going to get rid of all the administrative staff and so forth, and I'll just be a healer and just keep it very simple. But then I ended up finding that I was having to spend a lot of time returning phone calls and coordinating and doing accounting and a lot of other tasks in addition to doing the service. And so again, I found myself spread pretty thin. Now, I've actually allowed myself to go back to being an employee and working within some group practices. And that actually seems to be good for me on a lot of different levels. It allows me to focus on doing the clinical work without having to also be, worrying about all that other kinds of stuff. And interestingly enough, when I talked to you about that tension that I had about not taking money, in this way, the person has a business relationship with the practice then pays me as an employee, and so it actually works out a little bit cleaner in terms of my giving of care to a person without expecting something directly in return. So if you had to ask me what the biggest struggle for me has been, it's been balancing the business with the healer aspect.
So going back to those patients then, what kind of patients, whether it's in terms of their ages or conditions, do you commonly see in practice or find that respond best to your type of care?
Well, I'll tell you, I sometimes say ironic things. And one of the ironic statements that I made to my mom that she just laughs about is I told her that I actually like to help people who don't need me. So and what that really comes down to is I think that I've found that I don't like to treat sick people so much. What I actually am the best at is taking people with a lot of strengths and helping them be able to fine tune so that they can actually function at more of a peak optimal level. And so my caseload these days is really loaded with like pretty high functioning professionals. Oftentimes they're very bright. They oftentimes take a lot of care of their physical wellness, and they uh, are have relationships and are functioning. But usually there's some area of their life where they just feel that something's out of place. Maybe they're not relating with their kids the way they would like to. Perhaps there's something that's not satisfying in their marriage. Maybe they are wanting to take some kind of step in terms of their professional development, but are held back. Maybe they're finding that they're drinking a little bit, more than is good for them. It's really kind of helping people who are doing pretty well do great that I really have found that I'm most exceptional.
Okay, interesting. And I know, of course, you have a busy client list. Actually, I tried to send someone to you, and I mean, not to do your discredit, but you can't fit them in because you're literally filled up. What do you think is the most important factor of your own success?
Well, I would say that the most valuable thing a person can have is a good reputation, and it's something that you can't buy, and it's something that could easily be lost pretty easily. And so one of the things that I think has made a really big difference for me is people have actually gone online and written about their experiences with me. And when people come do a little bit, now everybody goes online and can research people. When you look a little bit deeper beneath the hood with me, you'll see that going back, 5, 10 years, just person after person after person is writing about really an exceptional experience. Um, Now, the things that go into permitting that exceptional experience also are really important to comment on. And one is really caring about people and being sincere in what one does. I once saw a quote that said, "Before people will care how much you know, they have to know how much you care." And so I think that is probably a bedrock of my success. People consistently talk about they experience me as somebody who has a very big heart and experience me as sincere. But beyond that, another thing is that I don't just put people through a cookie cutter treatment. I actually really, not only do I care, but I care to really understand what's going on with a person. And then in Buddhism, we talk about this thing called skillful means, that I apply just what's needed to help the person progress. And so if you look back at the different kinds of reviews that people had, they'll explain very different things. They'll talk about helping them in a relationship. They'll talk about getting them unstuck with their forming a multi-million-dollar business. They'll talk about overcoming a fear of flying, which then opens up the person's life to all kinds of wonderful experiences. And you'd almost think like, how could this all be, from the same clinician? But it's really because I'm staying really focused on what's needed rather than trying to impose just some preconceived idea of what everybody needs.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I mean, again, whether it's for yourself, whether it's a cardiologist, sometimes making the smallest tweak can have such a big change in so many different factors of someone's life. You open up the way someone thinks about maybe, I don't know, their childhood or something like that as an example. It could change how they work, how they treat other people, how they treat themselves, and everything else. So I completely understand that. Absolutely.
Yeah, in fact, I was really impressed with our conversation. You told me that if a person comes to you and they don't need an adjustment, you tell them, hey, you don't need an adjustment today. You don't.
Fantastic. Yeah.
But I've actually gone to chiropractors who just feel like they've got to put everybody through the same, sequence. Maybe just so that people like feel like they're getting something for their money or something. But I recognize that in you, and I would say that this mindset that I have, and that I think we both share, of wanting to apply just what's needed, really grows out of a mindfulness practice of being present with what is. And so I think that another bedrock beyond having the open heart and beyond being able to intervene on a lot of different levels is really being able to stay with reality as it is, to not distort. And that's one of the things that I've cultivated through my 12 plus years of meditation practice. And that's something that I really know has value to my clients, which is by incorporating teaching of mindfulness and meditation with psychotherapy, then people can really see things clearly as they are and can then know what needs to be done rather than responding to all kinds of distortions and projections and kind of things that keep them from being able to really recognize what needs to happen.
I mean, sometimes it's almost too easy, especially when you have a lot of experience like yourself, to want to do everything and to try to do everything. I'm actually reading a book at the moment, a textbook on adaptability. One of the things they talk about is, say, in the body, it's all about that kind of efficiency of means. So it's like the example of, say, if somebody's doing exercise and it gets them to a point where they put themselves in a slightly stressful situation, they get stronger. You go beyond that, you injure yourself. Same thing with a banana. Eat one, it's healthy. 1,000, it's probably not a good idea. It's kind of the same thing with words as well. I'd imagine if you started to give people too many things to do, it's either too much on them or too overwhelming.
But that requires being attuned and really knowing exactly, how much is needed and how much is going to be too much. In psychology, there's a concept that we have called optimal frustration. And it's really, the idea is that you want to support the person, but then you also want to challenge them just enough so that then they start being able to take on the things and do them for themselves. And we love to put all kinds of complex words on things, but that internalizing of these abilities and starting to do for oneself, we call transmuting internalization. But that comes about by the healer being very much tuned in and responding to the person that they're working with in a way that they can adjust the challenge level so that it's optimal and not overwhelming or frustrating, or not too frustrating. Discouraging.
Yeah, encourage, that's a good word. You mentioned before about, of course, experience being a big factor, and especially I think for your work, it makes a lot of sense. Is there much of a mentorship that goes along with, say, when you're first in practice? And again, is that something that's very prevalent here in Singapore as well, if it is something that is a big practice?
Yeah, so really, this is kind of true both in terms of me as a psychologist and me in terms of a Buddhist practitioner, which is really these things all come about through mentoring and teaching. And so I could sort of, I was talking to you about even early on, serving as a research assistant and teaching assistant, but then all those hours of supervised experience that we receive, and then, even once you get past the formal supervised experience, then working with more experienced people who take you under their wing and show you the way. All of those things have been hugely important in my development. It really as a psychologist, but also as a Buddhist practitioner. I mentioned to you about having a monk that I studied with for 4 years. And so I personally feel a commitment to pay that forward and to support other people who are coming along in their development. So contributing to local professional organizations is one way. Back in America, I served as the chair of the professional practice committee of the Orange County Psychological Association. I ended up taking on a lot of pre-licensed people as what are called psychological assistants, and so you mentor them along. First, they observe you working with clients, and then they start doing some aspects of it, and then you can support them in starting to do some things with on their own. But first, they'll talk to you about it, and then eventually they'll learn to plan things out and just kind of run it by you, and then before you know it, they only call on you when there's some confusion. And so I'm sure it's much the same in chiropractic and just about any kind of craft. And, and so I'm very, if there are people who are in their development, not just as a psychologist, but even in spiritual practitioner, various other kinds of things, I'm always interested in seeing how I can support them. And even if your people who are watching this felt so inclined to reach out to me, I would try to assist in any way I can. Maybe if it's even just figuring out who to send them to or introduce them to.
Absolutely, I think that's very important. It's not just always about us being the person that helps, but if we can't, it's ethical to send them to the right person.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. And it's all a flow, that's in, I don't mean to be preaching from Buddhist perspective, but there's an idea in Buddhism of karma and of how one cause leads to an effect, which then sets up a cause for another thing, and you can start, if you pull back and you look at that, how it plays out, you can realize that that the force of different events or actions have just a whole series of dominoes that they result in. And so what I really try to do is I try to think about how I can contribute to the positive forces in the world or the universe, and I can recognize that in many ways I'm just kind of allowing a force that was allowed to be imparted to me to now flow through and benefit another. And so mentoring, coaching, giving guidance and encouragement, all are ways of letting that positivity flow through us, I think.
So for your own practice, and of course, say for the profession as a whole, because of course, you say to yourself, you've been on boards before. What are some goals you have, either for, again, your own practice or for the profession as more of a whole?
Well, I think I mentioned one thing, which is I personally have in my heart a desire to do more residential retreats. I personally have this desire to maybe even transition out of being a psychologist who just sees people in an office, hour by hour, and to really become more of a teacher, kind of facilitator. And so what I would imagine may not come about for a few years, but I would imagine that I will get to a point where I will actually travel the world, and I will have retreats and seminars, and I will try to probably take on different students that I will be mentoring, who will then be evolving their own projects and practices around the world, and so I kind of think that might be an outgrowth of my coming to full fruition, and that may also include bringing that kind of teaching online through videos and other types of content, but that's so in a weird kind of way, the ultimate fruition of my being a psychologist is to no longer be a psychologist. But in terms of my own practice, I'm really just kind of looking forward to just continuing to to become more and more masterful in my craft. And so um, I would expect that over the next, say, 5 years or 3 years, say, um, I may actually try to not do anything, particularly grandiose, but really um, just focus on the work. So that's what I'm mostly looking forward to. Related to that, I was mentioning to you that um, I have decided to take a position here in Singapore with a group that's called Body with Soul, and they are a multidisciplinary wellness center that has osteopaths and physiologists, physiotherapists, I think they're called,
Okay.
occupational therapy, and psychologists. And I'm really looking forward to just really finding my place within this holistic wellness healing center. So that's probably what I'll be doing for the next 3 to 5 years.
Interesting. I agree with what you were saying as well. I mean, I have someone I used to work with before who used to say that the kind of the purpose of you is to kind of get to a point where you become obsolete because people do not need your service. But to some extent, it's a little bit unrealistic because there's always going to be people who will say have stressful events, things they want to improve about the psychology. It's hard to get to that point, but you can always make a bigger impact by nurturing others and by teaching others rather than trying to always be the person who does everything. And I
Yeah,
think it's hard to teach that unless we have, of course, developed that proficiency in what we're
yeah,
doing.
I think that's true. That's true. But you know what? The other thing that I'm finding is that I may not know exactly where things are gonna end up. And um, there's another mindfulness practice that I'll just mention, which is sometimes it helps to just focus on taking the next indicated step. So you don't necessarily need to know, the whole 5-year plan. It's just staying very present with what's called for, and then just responding and making the best decision given all the factors in the given moment. So I think maybe some of what I told you is filled with distortion because I don't know what's going to be called for, and I think that what I'm really telling you is right now I'm just staying with doing the next indicated step, and in this moment it's just allowing myself to walk into this turnkey holistic wellness center and just find my place as one of the healers.
It's kind of funny in a sense. You've basically stolen the words out of the mouth of the guest we have on tomorrow morning, who I have heard numerous times say, whenever someone breaks something down to their problems, what's the next logical step?
Yeah.
It really does help.
What's that per discipline? What are they coming from?
He's a chiropractor as well, but he also works in more, again, he's been working for about 25 or so years. So it's more training and nurturing others to improve, not just in chiropractic, but for generally service-based industries.
Yeah. Yeah, and I'll say that some of the times when I've run into problems professionally and also in my life is when I've imposed some kind of a preconception, and then I've overruled taking in additional information that may have sort of suggested that something else was called for. And it's when I'm kind of pushing like a bull in a china shop that I create problems. And I'll just share like a way I think about it philosophically is as I take on more of a receptive attitude where I can start allowing, then things tend to flow more naturally. There's less resistance, and so I find that when people are functioning at their best, they do actively take steps to set up the conditions which will then allow things to unfold. But very rarely does it involve like pushing or forcing based upon some internal preconception that one's imposing on the external reality.
In terms of preconceptions and expectations, how big a role do you think that plays in problems like depression or general mental health?
Well, I think it has a lot to do with depression and probably with all kinds of different maladjustments. In cognitive therapy, there's a concept. It's called cognitive distortions, and an even deeper extension of that idea gets into what they call core beliefs, and another related concept that we talk about are schemas. And so all of these are inherently distorted preconceptions that then um, limit a person's flexibility in really recognizing what's in front of one and what's called for. And so there are particular um, cognitive distortions and particular attributional styles cognitively that can leave a person more vulnerable to depression or leave another person more vulnerable to anxiety. And so just regarding depression, I would say that people who become depressed tend to see situations as fixed, meaning not subject to change. They tend to conclude that the results that they're getting are all internal, and they don't recognize that there's an interaction of themselves and context. And they also, let's see, fixed, internal, and global. So that they don't really see that there are some situations where a thing might apply and some situations where a thing won't apply. And so it's just like, I'm a loser, I'll always be a loser, and that's all there is to it. Well, that doesn't leave one very empowered to take control of actually setting up the conditions that will allow positive things to play out, and as a result, depression. Um, but the same is true with anxiety. The same is true with people who find themselves, maladjustedly, hostile or angry all the time. It's inflexibilities that are inherently based upon uh, distorted, limited conceptualizations of what really is. And so that's where there's a type of therapy that I practice that's called mindfulness-based cognitive behavioral therapy, and it's really that integrating of mindfulness and of being able to sit with and recognize the natural great perfection of things as they are, that then frees a person up to be able to respond most adaptively. And so part of that response is in the conclusions that one forms, but then another part is that then opens up the possibility for acting and responding in new and more strategic ways that set up the conditions that will allow the positive thing to unfold. And so yeah, inherently it's distorted projections that are inherent, and for which mindfulness is really a hugely important component.
Okay. So, in an ideal world, what kind of changes would you love to see in healthcare systems, either here in Singapore or in other countries?
Well, in an ideal world, I think that more attention would be put on prevention and on health rather than treating of sickness, and just not just related to mental health, but I would just say in health generally. One of the things that's been very confusing to me here in Singapore is I'm finding that things like immunizations or wellness checks are not covered under insurance. They're not, they're inherently not valued and promoted, thus setting up the likelihood that a person has to wait until they'll have some sort of difficult or intractable condition before we'll actually do something about it. And so I would say, right now when I'm talking to you about like this holistic wellness center that I'm going to go be part of and all this wonderful, growth-oriented stuff we're doing, the thing that I didn't say is that this is a very exclusive treatment environment that's really accessed primarily by the most affluent people here in Singapore. And what I would really hope to see is that the best kind of most sensible approach to promoting wellness wouldn't just be reserved for the few, but could actually be shared with the many. That's what I
And how do you feel then about the idea, say, like a universal healthcare or more socialist? I guess socialism is kind of the key word here for a lot of people, but that kind of healthcare system, how would you feel more about that?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. And when I look at different models, I've seen it play out differently, and I don't really know what distinguishes one from the other. I would say from everything that I know, Sweden seems to be doing just a great job with socialized medicine. And then I hear about other countries where, say, even in Canada or perhaps in the UK. I hear about people who are having to just wait unrealistically long periods of time to get, an MRI when there's like real serious cause for concern and so forth. And I don't really, I don't have enough knowledge about broader systems of care to know, what distinguishes one from the other. But what I would hope is that if we move towards more of those models, that somehow quality and individualized care doesn't get lost, and the how-tos of that, I'm not exactly sure. Now, from a grassroots level, I think that if all of us dedicated some time to not just trying to make money, but also just being of service, that would also go a long way to making these things available, not just to an exclusive bunch of people. And so the thing I will talk about is I personally am finding that by balancing those things, I talked about having stepped away from private practice and going and being of service in Thailand. Now I think having a balance where I'm doing a fair amount of community service and I am doing this kind of high-end kind of practice, that is, from a Buddhist perspective, I think represents taking the middle path, and I think that goes a little bit towards that direction. Now, whether we can spread this bodhicitta among our fellow healers and fellow humans and set up a motivation, a revolution of consciousness, I can only hope.
Absolutely. And so, given the current lockdown, what are some tips or some advice you would have for people who are spending more time at home? I saw recently that the government is now actually opening up more time for psychologists. So clearly, there are some things going on. What would be some of your advice?
Well, one thing I would tell you is I've set up a free online support group for expats here in Singapore, and I actually started it by just posting on Facebook, and it's something that folks have taken a big interest in. And so, if anybody, particularly expats here in Singapore, but maybe elsewhere, was feeling very, very isolated during this time, I would say find some sort of a group to participate in. And I only have space for 10 people in this one that I'm doing. Maybe I would start up another one if enough people reached out to me. But I'm glad to do my part, but I probably won't meet the whole need. But basically, human beings are social animals, and what I think one of the big dangers of this, circuit breaker period is that some people are finding themselves very, very isolated, and human beings don't do well in isolation. If you want to drive someone mad, just put them in solitary confinement. And so I think what we're doing right now is finding a way to make a human connection, utilizing technology. I think there are existing forums out there, but also people might be able to form their own. When I was a graduate student, I just formed a peer process group with other male therapists, and we ended up meeting every week for 3.5 years. It didn't take any money. We just all made it a priority to just meet once a week, and amazing things unfolded. So I think that there's probably more people than you know who would be receptive if you would just even put out feelers. And I'm telling you, like, I'm hosting this peer process group. I mean, this sort of support group for expats. But that's, it sounds kind of grandiose, but really all I'm doing is holding some space and inviting people to let's all get together and chat. It doesn't take a PhD to do such a thing, really.
Before we go today, just kind of getting a little bit more personal. If you could talk to yourself, say 5 years ago, what kind of advice would you give to yourself?
Well, here's the irony is everything depends on everything. And so if anything changed, then I wouldn't be where I am right now. And so in reality, I think everything had to play out the way that it did. But if myself was sitting in front of me, I would tell myself to invest in relationships and to um, not not think that the solution is to just struggle, work and work and work, but to rather shift into an attitude of allowing. And I'll tell you just a little kind of story that goes along with that. When I first took on my monk master, he's was the most famous monk in Thailand. He would teach to big coliseums of people. I said to him, I said, I would love to do what you've done. How can I prepare to do that? And he said, you don't have to do anything. And I said, what? I was like, no way. All my life I've struggled. I struggled to get into college, and I struggled to get into graduate school, and I struggled to get my license, and I struggled to build a practice, and I struggled. Everything's been a struggle. What do you mean I don't have to do anything? He said, you don't have to do anything. All you have to do is be loving and peaceful. And I was like, nah, come on. Like I thought this guy was like feeding me a line. And then when I started, he then assigned a monk to work with me. And when I was studying with this monk, and I started to learn some deep absorption states and learning how to meditate more deeply. The the monk told me, don't try to do anything, to just relax and rest in the natural state, just what is. I was like, no way, this is much too easy. I must have to be reciting 20 different things and doing this and doing that. And he said, no, 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 no. All of that is just like this test that we give to people to see if they're really serious. But the real practice is what I'm teaching you. And again, I told him, I said, that's way too easy. And he said, it's only easy if you do it right. And so, I think I've kind of throughout our conversation, I've been alluding to this idea of not forcing and allowing, and of being loving and being peaceful. And if I had really received that message earlier on, I might have saved myself and others around me a lot of suffering. But, and here's the real but, I also realized that we become enlightened not despite our confusion, but actually as a result of our confusion. Buddha had to actually hit the wall and have things fall apart for him decide to sit down and actually say, I'm not going to get up from under this tree until I figure some stuff out. And so um, the reality is that thank God I've come to this understanding and I found this way to live now. But I think I had to go through some hard knocks in order to get here, and I think that's true of probably all of us.
Well, thank you very much for joining me today, David. Thank you everyone who's been watching either live or watching on the replay. If you have any questions, of course, you can put them in the comments or you can contact me on 84389550. And of course, I'll make sure that David's tagged in the description. So if you have any questions or if you want to join his group, of course, you can just message him directly and he'll be able to help you out from there. At this point, I just want to say, everyone stay safe and try to look out for each other.
Yeah, sounds great. And like I said, I told Shane that it's absolutely fine with me if people contact me directly. And so, you know, he was kind of saying like, do you really want to just give your personal Facebook? And really, it's gotten to a point for me where there really isn't a separation between myself professionally and who I am personally. It's all coherent. So if people just wanted to send me a message through Facebook, it's more than welcome. And I'll look forward to hearing from you.
Thank you very much, David.
Yeah.